So before we jump into the session and the introductions, let me just run through a couple of quick formalities. Firstly, to maintain the quality of the line, we have muted all participants. There is a chat function in the bottom right of your screen where you can make comments and ask questions. We'll be monitoring this as we go through, and we'll take questions for the speakers after the presentation. So please do ask questions, and remember to let us know your name and the organisation you are from. We have also received some questions through the registration process, and we'll be doing our best to feed these in a little later on too. Please also keep an eye out for some survey questions that will appear also in the bottom right of your screen as we go, and we'd really appreciate you guys answering these. Please note that the session will be recorded and made available after the webinar, along with the presentation deck. We also have Angela Rouse, the Senior Programme Manager of the CDAC Network, on the line for any troubleshooting with webinar access. So I hope all that makes sense. If there are some problems in participation, please do let us know through the chat box, and we will do whatever we can to help. I should also note just a few technical challenges we've been having as we've been putting this together over the last sort of 15 to 20 minutes. So if there are some pauses while we flick between slides, please do bear with us. So let me now turn to today's speakers, who join us from InsightShare. InsightShare are a UK-based organisation and leading practitioners in the field of participatory video, which is what we will be learning about today. InsightShare are a member of the CDAC network and partnered with us in Bangladesh last year as part of the DEPP. Firstly, we have Soledad Muniz. Sole is InsightShare's Head of Innovation and Development and specialises in participatory communication with particular skills and experience in deploying participatory video in international development. She has over 9 years' experience researching, planning and implementing participatory video projects with a strong understanding of the application and potential of the tool in a range of contexts. Sole, welcome. We also have Marlene Bovenmars, Head of Training and Design at InsightShare. Marlene has delivered over 30 participatory video projects in 11 different countries and is currently InsightShare's most active trainer. Over the past decade, she has worked with a wide variety of groups ranging from indigenous communities in sub-Saharan Africa and subsistence farmers in the Himalayas to homeless people and refugees in Europe. At InsightShare, Marlene is responsible for harvesting and disseminating methodological learning across the team. She was also InsightShare's focal person for the project in Bangladesh, which we will be learning more about today. Marlene is joining us from Montreal, so many thanks, Marlene, for working around the time difference. It's great to have you with us. I should also say that as the lead agency on this project, we had hoped to have representation from ActionAid Bangladesh. Unfortunately, today is a public holiday in Bangladesh, so we were not able to make that work. So quickly, in terms of format, I will begin by introducing the CDAC network and the DEPP. Sole will then take us through the participatory video methodology, and Marlene will then lead us through her experience of using PV as an evaluation tool in Bangladesh. We'll then have plenty of time for a good question and answer session. So, if you're not too sick of my voice already, let me start by saying a few words on the CDAC network for those of you not familiar with us. Communicating with and providing information for people affected by crisis are two of the most important elements of humanitarian response, yet they are also two of the most overlooked. The CDAC network is a cross-sector collaboration bringing together a diverse group of members, including the humanitarian and media development organisations as well as technology providers. Together, the network's aims are threefold. Firstly, that affected communities are better able to access life-saving information, voice their needs, ideas and feedback, and make informed decisions about their recovery. Secondly, that humanitarian practitioners and organisations are better prepared and able to provide life-saving information and communicate with crisis-affected communities, enhancing the effectiveness of a response. Thirdly and finally, that the humanitarian system ensures that communication with affected communities is a predictable, coordinated and resourced element of disaster preparedness, response and recovery. Part of the work we do in relation to the second aim is to run events for practitioners by practitioners, and it is under this remit that we bring you to this webinar today. So the DEPP. To further the network's three key aims, CDAC partnered with DEPP and the START network in 2014 to deliver the flagship Disasters and Emergencies Preparedness Programme. The DEPP is a 40 million, 4-year program encompassing 14 projects in 10 countries, implemented by over 40 organizations. It was designed to significantly improve the speed and quality of humanitarian response in crisis-prone countries. It sought to strengthen the capacity of the humanitarian system at all levels, with a particular focus on training and development for local and national humanitarian workers. It also sought to strengthen national preparedness systems. Since 2014, the CDAC network has directly managed one of these projects. The aim of the project has been to contribute to this improved effectiveness of humanitarian assistance through predictable, coordinated and resourced two-way communication. The project has been delivered in 3 countries, Bangladesh, South Sudan and the Philippines, with additional advocacy, capacity building and technical support provided by the CDAC Network Secretariat in London. Through the CDAC DEPP, we have partnered with no less than 18 organisations through a range of local initiatives and many, many more through the collaborative platforms in the 3 countries. Broadly speaking, the project has been delivered through 3 work streams. Firstly, establishing national-level collaborative platforms, or working groups, in Bangladesh and South Sudan to promote coordination and practice around communicating with communities. Secondly, strengthening capacity in communicating with communities through a collection of core activities. These have included things such as the CDAC network's technical training, emergency simulations, and global-level advocacy. And finally, a portfolio of locally designed projects, planned and funded through the national-level platforms, all contributing to strengthening national-level policy and practice around communication and community engagement. And it's under this third stream that ActionAid and InsightShare came together in Bangladesh to deliver this participatory video pilot project. This was one of 7 locally designed projects that were funded through the CDAC DEPP in Bangladesh, and in my opinion, definitely one of the most exciting. Through the project, we now have a manual on using participatory video for humanitarian evaluations, available in both English and Bangla. We have a report on the evaluation findings themselves, as well as a collection of videos which can be accessed through InsightShare's YouTube page. We will be sharing links for all of these in the chat box. All resources developed under the DEPP will also be available through a new Preparedness microsite, which will be made available through the CDAC network website. More information about this will be shared soon via the network's monthly newsletter, so please do keep an eye out for that. So I think that's probably more than enough from me. Of course, do share any questions you may have on the CDAC network or the wider DEPP via the chat. Otherwise, I think it's probably time for me to hand over to InsightShare and firstly Soleil to hear a bit more about the participatory video methodology. So assuming Soleil all is well on your side, I will hand over to you now.
Thanks, Chris, for that. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. I was going to, you did an amazing introduction, Chris, to us. I was just wanting to share a little bit with you the journey until today, in terms of our methodological approaches, and a little bit the preface to Marlene describing what happened in Bangladesh, because I think it could be useful for many of you to understand the potential of the methodology. So I'm going to look more at the background of our method and the evolution of it a little bit. I would add only to what Chris said in terms of who we are, that we are a social enterprise. So we have a model where we do non-for-profit work long-term with some communities around the world, particularly indigenous groups, and through our consultancy work from the UN to all the organizations in the sector, from small NGOs to big ones, we fed back our profits into that network. So that's who we are in terms of our structure, and we are a team that is based all around the world with a small core team in the UK. I think it will be useful for me to start with, if Angela, you can play the video now. So for those of you who may not know so much about participatory video and who we are, we're going to watch a short 2-minute introduction to our theory of change, in a way, of why we think participatory video is a useful methodology. Okay, Sorry, I don't know if everybody could hear everything throughout, but I just posted on the chat box the link to the website in the homepage. You can watch the video. But basically, we thought, you know, in a 2-minute video, you will be able to find a little bit more the theory of change behind our thinking of why participatory video works. Now, I think I wanted to start with some acknowledgements because I think, particularly in my view, one of the biggest values of being part of an organization like CDAC Network is what it can pull together in terms of the different organizations in the sector in pushing the thinking around the importance of two-way communication, community engagement, and downward accountability in the sector. So these conversations have been going for some time, and particularly I wanted to acknowledge Anahi Ayala Yakuchi from Internews, that for a couple of years ago when we became members of CDAC, we had a couple of presentations together in different panels, and we started to discuss the potential of using this in the clusters in country. And she was engaged in the DEPP cluster in South Sudan and initially proposed it as an idea there. And we tried to make that happen, but for security reasons, that wasn't possible. That's when the DEPP team, and at that time was Jonathan Napier as well around, started to look at the option of bringing this to Bangladesh as a pilot, where it was appropriate in terms of safety, and also the partners were really keen to test this. So just to acknowledge, I think, the contribution on thinking and evolving these ideas with us, Anahia and Jonathan, I think, really important. I want to start by looking at just, I don't want to assume we all have the same understanding of what participatory monitoring and evaluation means, as we all may come from different roles in the sector. So a quick definition that we use in our toolkit from Widget in now 1999, seems quite far away, is the importance of involving every stakeholder as part of evaluation. That's what really means participatory M&E. And I would say in agreeing how progress is measured and what kind of assumptions we are going to test. So for us, that's quite crucial when we design any process of using participatory video in monitoring and evaluation, that everybody is at the table discussing what is implied in their lives and in their projects. In terms of what is participatory video, you know, there are lots of definitions out there, so this is not an academic definition, but one that InsightShare uses a lot, which is really simply bringing people together with a specific methodology to create their own film, and that can have different purposes. In this case, it's for evaluation. And we have been working around bringing participatory video most significant change for the past 12 years since our first trial. And most significant change for those of you who may not know the methodology is a process where you collect significant stories of change and systematically select them with diverse groups of people that are all involved in different ways in the program. I would say some of the key things around the value of using participatory video. First of all, the process is not traditional in the way of usual ways of education where you teach people something. This is exploratory and using a really similar model to participatory action research, where people experience the methodology by doing. And through that process, they reflect in every of their actions. And those reflections lead to new actions. There is a crucial aspect of the methodology which looks at helping people self-represent themselves and discuss and think around how to do that, how to represent themselves, who they want to talk to, and for what purposes. So people have a strong sense of how they want to come across to others through the process, which we think is quite crucial in an industry that tends to choose how to represent its constituencies, I would call them, rather than beneficiaries, and the people that we are there to serve. And I would say the other key aspects are around creating dialogue among diverse groups of people and encouraging different types of group into being part of a process, and through that being part of a process gaining something. So when we talk about empowerment, really is not only around growing in skills potentially or in self-esteem, but also making sure that what they are expecting of that process is taken into account, and they are at the table of decision making, I would say. And collective ownership is quite crucial as well for us, and we encourage all organizations we work with to do licensing through Creative Commons rather than copyrights of all the outputs that come out of a process like this, so community members can use that information as much as they want, particularly the videos, that in most cases is what they want to utilize, and not necessarily the reports, but you know, to make accessible all the information for them to use it. I would say, in a nutshell, the methodology involves, I would say, groups of people. We work quite a lot through group dynamics rather than traditional ways of making video, where you involve different people in different roles and they take decisions sometimes individually. Or you know, some of you may know around citizen journalism or other forms of media making where it's more around one person's idea. In a process like this, we bring people together to tell stories and to collectively take the decisions of which story is the most significant, film it together, and also discuss consent and agree that collectively. So group dynamics is quite crucial in our processes, I have to say. And then also a group of community members would take part in analyzing the results. For us also, in whatever design a project has, we encourage that to happen because it brings really different insights to what staff could analyze by themselves. Some of the key things that I would say are the added value of the methodology. Particularly, I would say the unpacking unexpected results, information that you cannot necessarily look at from traditional M&E methodologies like a survey, where you can understand much more how things happened and why, rather than what happened, which you can track with many other methodologies. The aspect that it strengthens ownership, from the learning, and it has, I would say, an immediate use, both in people's lives as much as for staff, particularly who are working on those issues in whatever role, to immediately use that learning in their decision making on how that program can change, or if it's an end of program evaluation, how that can influence the design of the next cycle of programming. The other key aspect, I would say, is that it merges really well with other many methodologies. Like in any sensible research and monitoring evaluation strategy, this is one methodology that you have to combine with others to have your mixed methods approach. And I would say it can combine really well with traditional methods where you potentially want to use for tracking your indicators or for generating your quantitative results. And it can give you really interesting qualitative information, in my view, and experience. And you can use it throughout the life cycle of the project. So both from baseline to monitoring and evaluation. Some some key things around when I would say you're ready to use these, particularly if you want to listen to community members and establish a dialogue, and you're ready to learn as much as to take this learning into future programming. That's quite crucial. And also you're happy to accept consent proposed by the storytellers. Not necessarily when you want to engage in an advocacy process or just in reporting, upward accountability, where you have other methodologies that are best placed to do that. So that's quite crucial, that you want to engage also in a dialogue and downward accountability process, as well as you have the capacity to take on that learning. You will find all these learning and detailed methodology published in our toolkit that you can access for free in our website. This was published in 2015 with the support of UNICEF and C4D network. And, it's the learning from those 12 years for 20 plus evaluations and 13 countries. I have really good feelings, and I feel quite optimistic that I see many organizations taking this on in the humanitarian sector beyond this particular Bangladesh example that now Marlene will present. And just to name a few, UNICEF in Pakistan is using it now for WASH. Hand in Hand Syria is using it in Syria, starting to think about using it in Syria to look at some of the key aspects coming from some of their trauma healing work and psychosocial support work. And British Red Cross and Nepal Red Cross, now they're putting it into their strategy after some conversations we had last year on how they could use it for evaluating some of their work on recovery in Nepal. So I think the future is bright. And the only last thing I will say before handing over to Marlene is that the design will change in each context and in each program. So what we are going to share with you today is an example of what it looks like in the ground. But in each context, we would look at identifying who should be part of an evaluation, who should be part of field work process, screenings, and what's the best way to design the methodology for that particular evaluation and content.
Okay, we will just have to quickly set up the presentation.
So I think while this is uploading, and apologies for this, maybe we can just start with a couple of questions. So I would encourage people, if they have any questions on Solei's original presentation, to pop them in the chat. Anything to do with the PV methodology more broadly. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we did have a couple of these in the registration process. So, Solei, I might just throw one of these at you now while we're waiting.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah.
Great. So, I mean, you did mention in your presentation just now about, using PV in baseline and other stages of the M&E process. I mean, one of the questions we had was actually about using these kind of approaches at earlier stages in the response for program design, but also course correction. And I think we do look at communicating with communities as being a key approach to allow us to course correct in our programming. And how you see PV contributing to that, or even being a tool for that.
Yeah, I think definitely in countries where you have an ongoing operation, and we know today on average, for example, in countries where there are refugee camps, the average refugee stays in a camp is 15 to 20 years. So there are certain contexts where it makes complete sense to use this process also as a baseline. I would say if you have to respond immediately to a particular disaster where there was not capacity already in place, where you could potentially have this information in advance, we know that the first few months is all about responding. But I would say you could use it once you pass the initial stage of the emergency to monitor what's happening so far and what people would like, rather than leave this for an evaluation at the end. Marlene will share more details now, but for me, one of the key learnings from Bangladesh that struck me when I read the report and I saw the learnings was that, people said things like how they feel that the organizations should use them to prepare for things. And they don't think that they are being utilized properly. That normally when aid arrives 3 days later, it's too late. So there are certain things that I feel are potentially useful for other responses in that same country or region when they have similar kind of disasters. And then, as I say, for a monitoring process after the initial months of emergency, you could definitely use it as to see how things are going, establish a conversation with the community, or if you already did with other tools, continue that and go deeper into their role as much as your role in that process. Particularly, I would say to do it as a cluster, which I find that extremely efficient in terms of resources, as much as the usefulness of the data for all the players, the government and all the organizations in that country, without each one individually having to target the same population with different processes, which we know how exhausting for people that is. So yeah, I find working in a cluster could definitely give you value to do it, at least as a monitoring process. And you can do it as a baseline when you have an ongoing process in a country, I would say.
Great, Solly. Thank you very much. Marlene, let me just check on how things are going. Are you ready?
Yep, I'm already here.
Fantastic. I will pass over to you then.
Okay, so for the story of this project, I would like to take you back to the spring of 2017, to the two communities in which we carried out the pilot project. And they're basically located in the north of Bangladesh, in two districts, Gaibandha and Kurigram. And the communities, they're both right next to a river, and they're actually affected by flooding every summer. But for this project, we specifically focused on evaluating the flood response during the previous summer, so 2016. And our second aim, as was already explained, was really to explore how participatory video can be used to facilitate the true two-way dialogue between disaster-affected communities and all other stakeholders involved in response efforts. So the first step of our process was to train these 6 lovely young people. And instead of our trainers facilitating, we actually always train community representatives to form a local evaluation team. And for this project, it really made sense to work with young people, as they had all the time and energy that was needed to fully lead on each step of the process. So in any project, the first step of our process is basically starting with the video shooting, so the light and the fun part. And so through a series of playful exercises, the trainees slowly familiarized themselves with all the pieces of the equipment. And then through rotating roles, the camera person, sound person, speaker in front of the camera, the youth basically gradually build up all their confidence, and also by watching back and discussing all the footage, they learned all the basics. So basically through a lot of mistakes and laughter. Then to prepare them to take the lead in the data collection in their own communities, I then facilitated a full story collection and selection process with them as the participants. So that enabled them to just learn from my example, but more importantly, also it ensured that they knew what it feels like to participate, and that they were just better able to encourage and support their community members in the days to come. The following steps that I will present now, they were basically carried out in both communities. And in the first community, I was there to guide and support them. And then after I left, they again carried out the full process in the second community, but with the guidance of the ActionAid Bangladesh staff. And to participate in the evaluation, we basically selected 4 groups of 15 participants. So one group of women, one group of girls, one group of men, and one group of boys. And we, of course, ensured that these groups were really representative of the wider community in terms of having various ages, socioeconomic backgrounds, and abilities. And then in each community, the youth facilitated one story circle with each of the 4 groups. So the fact that the youth were leading on this really made it easier for the participants to open up and to really share their experience as a story. So during the story circles, the participants took turns sharing their story of basically how they were affected by the flooding. And the team guided them with a few open and non-leading questions. So the first question was, what was challenging? Then what was helpful? And how could it be better in future? And with this last question, the participants were really encouraged to not just consider what the NGOs and the government representatives could do better, but also what they felt that they could do themselves in the community, so individually as well as collectively. All the stories were actually, as you can see here, recorded with a voice recorder. And all the 85 stories that were collected, together they really provided very valuable insights into people's experiences. And they, for example, clearly illustrated the impacts of the floods on their lives, but also all the factors that hindered or helped them in their recovery. Their stories showed, for example, how the households that were most in need, how they didn't receive any or not enough aid. Also, the story showed how many people didn't receive the kind of aid that they felt they actually most needed, and how some of the aid that was delivered was actually useless in their opinion, like the wrong type of seeds, for example. Then, after the story sharing, the trained youth used a quick analysis tool to basically help each group to identify and then nominate one person whose story they felt was kind of the most representative story for their group, so that the story that captured their collective experience the best. Yeah, basically the same process was carried out with all 4 groups in both communities. Next, the trained youth used this fun drawing exercise to support the participants to basically capture all the key elements of the selected story, which then also helped the storyteller to prepare for talking in front of the camera. And then each of the selected storytellers, they shared their story again somewhere in the community. And that way they could really talk in a familiar environment and also with the support and the presence of their peers. And then after filming, they straight away watched back their story so that they could decide if they wanted to re-record anything or add something, or if there were any parts of the video that they wanted to be left out. So this is a really important part of the consent process. And then finally, the team went around the community to film kind of so-called illustrative footage. So basically all the images that they wanted to use to illustrate the key parts of the experiences of the community members. So then back in the workup space, the team listened to all of the stories and analyzed them again with a table. And they used that table to extract all the key challenges, the helpful factors, and all the ideas about how things could be better in the future. And then by adding up how often each of these things was mentioned, they used the completed tables to identify all the most significant problems, enablers, and ideas. And that quantified overview that resulted from that, it already provided great insights, but in this case, it was only the beginning of the analysis, because next we used this cause and effect analysis to better understand the actual relationship between the various problems and enablers, and what were direct impacts, what were indirect impacts. And so this was really interesting for the young people to look at it in this way. And they also did a capacity analysis to basically separate what problems the community could address themselves and which issues they felt they could address with the support from outsiders. And then overall, the analysis helped the team to discover that some of the main barriers to effective aid had been the scarcity of distribution points and the great distances involved in reaching them, as well as the impact of nepotism on the distribution. So it also became clear that there were not actually enough shelter facilities in the community, and what issues people had experienced in the existing shelters. And then it was time for the editing, and we were lucky that in this program we had the time to teach the young people to do the basic video editing themselves. And I was very impressed by how quickly they actually learned to do this, and they organized all the different parts of people's stories to create a video that really neatly summarized the experience of the community according to all their key findings. Now, this next step is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting. So in many projects, this is kind of how VAR evaluation goes. But we have been at InsightShare very inspired by human-centered design methods. And so we decided to explore what would happen if we would work with the trainees and the participants to actually brainstorm about concrete ideas about how the flood response process could be actually better in future. So here you have an example of a so-called problem statement. So I helped the trainees basically to identify the priority areas in terms of the main problems, and then formulate a problem statement for each of those. And each problem statement basically is a summary that's built up of all the key needs that were identified and the causes of those, as well as the main impacts, the surprising factors, and also any opportunities that were there in the community to respond by themselves, as well as barriers. And after having those problem statements, the next step was to really extract a series of questions that could then help to guide discussions about ways to address the problems. So in this case, the 3 problem areas that had been selected were the aid distribution process, shelter facilities, and emergency transport. And for each of these, the trainees used the questions to basically design a solution. And a solution can, of course, take many different forms. And in this case, the team basically designed one object. So This is a improved raft that could be built very simply and cheaply with local skills and materials. And they also designed a building. So this is an ideal shelter center, and you can read more about it in the report. They basically identified all of the kind of facilities that could be used to address all the challenges, as well as ways in which the community members could use their own time and skills to be actively involved in the running of the shelter center. And finally, they also designed a service. So this is basically the whole aid distribution system reimagined from their perspective. So all the way from preparation to a complaints and evaluation process. And the system included a series of steps that would really enable it to do more timely and accurate needs assessments and to really minimize the opportunities for nepotism. So in this design, the community volunteers also played a key role in those needs assessments, and which could basically reduce the NGO staff time that would be required for the implementation. And I was really quite amazed by the ideas that they came up with. Then, after completing these designs, we went back to the community, and there the team presented their draft video as well as these designs to really check if the community members felt that the video provided a complete picture of their experiences, and to find out what they thought about the designs and if they had any ideas on how to further improve them. And then, thanks to the feedback of the community members, some of the missing topics were then filmed and the designs were worked out in even greater detail. And at the stakeholder screening in Uganda, it was also very clear that the local stakeholders that were present there were also very impressed to hear directly from the community members, and not only about how they were impacted, but they also really listened with great interest as the young people presented their designs. And when asked for feedback, the stakeholders were also very supportive of the ideas that were presented, and they asked many questions of how it could be implemented and pointed out some barriers. So it was a real nice dialogue between the stakeholders and the community representatives. And then after these discussions, the stakeholders were also invited to share their responses, so in front of the camera, so that these perspectives could also be streamed back to the communities. And that's how you get the true kind of two-way communication, bringing back the responses to the community members. So then the trainees finished their video, and then the outputs of the project, there were 5 short videos, as well as for each area, as well as a summary video. And these kind of products, of course, through online sharing and other face-to-face meetings, they can really reach a large amount of stakeholders, and particularly those who have no time to read long evaluation reports. And the videos of this project have been screened at a local, district, as well as national levels. And each time the attending stakeholders were asked what opportunities they could see to take forward the evaluation findings and the community's ideas.
Marlene, thanks so much. That's a really interesting presentation, and I thought a really good overview of the process. So thank you. We've had a couple of questions that popped in the chat, but I would obviously encourage participants, if they have more, to add some. If it's okay, I think we might end up overrunning by 5 minutes. I hope that's okay for people. I think it's good to hear about the process in full before we start answering questions. Anyway, Marlene, I'm going to throw one at you from Sandra Oliveira, which was, Marlene, can you describe on this step-by-step process that you're describing, what your role was. And I think that's quite interesting because, you know, we're talking about pushing evaluations into the hands of communities. So what is the role of the NGO, or in this case yourself, in leading this process?
Mm-hmm. So my role really was to, first of all, just train the local team. So just to ensure that they were comfortable with the basics of video making, so that they could effectively capture all the stories from the community members, and very much to make them comfortable with kind of holding space for the story sharing. So it was really all throughout the process, just a supportive role. And in the first community, I was kind of needed sometimes to remind them of the next steps, because they, of course, they can get a bit nervous when they deliver it for the first time. But actually, because we'd spent so much time preparing, really getting all the key steps clear in their minds, and because they had experienced it all themselves first, and they were working in teams, they were able to work very independently. So the role of the basically the staff members from the NGO can be just a supportive role to help with logistical stuff and to kind of assist them, encourage them when they need it.
Great, thank you. And I mean, this also ties into a question that I've had about this process. And you know, are there any issues about people being comfortable sharing their views on screen, or I mean, even as far as potentially protection or safety concerns, if you know, negative feedback is being shared with certain groups or stakeholders? Have you ever experienced any challenges with that?
Challenges like that can definitely come up, and so it's very important to first of all discuss them, the fact that that can come up with your trainees, and so that they are also able to really clearly explain that anything that the participants share, that they can first of all watch it back, but also really explain to them that the NGOs, they really want to hear what is their real experience. So really clarify to them that they are expecting to also hear negative feedback, and that they want that in order to improve the next response. So I think the key really is in explaining the purpose and really proving that it's a safe space for people to share. And of course, as a facilitator, you also have the role to check if people, for example, share stories, in this case about nepotism, to check with the local stakeholders, you know, is this going to put them at risk? Because they, for example, shared about the local chairman, saying he mostly shared, or he shared with his family members. And so you have to check if that kind of statements could bring them into trouble or not.
No, for sure. Okay, so I'll ask a couple of questions about, I suppose, the practical process, and then maybe something more general I'll throw towards Soleil. But we've got a couple of questions in the group. One from Sonia on how did you select the young people? And then another one from Fernanda on whether you used iPads as cameras on this project, and if, from your experience, there are any pros and cons from using iPads in this sort of context. So maybe those two questions first.
Yeah, so the young people were selected through some selection guidelines that we sent to the local partner. So we made it very clear that it was quite an intense process, so that whoever they selected had to have enough time to be part of the full process in both community as well as of the training days. So that made it clear that actually young people would be very a good group to work with, because they had holidays and they had basically the time. And in terms of why these young people, so we really emphasized that it's important to have people who are well respected in their community and who just have a real interest in the topic, in learning about the methodology, and it helped that they were educated, and that's particularly just helpful for the analysis process. It's just easier to follow and they pick it up quicker. Then in terms of the iPad, yeah, we used iPads to film, and we've done that in several projects now. And there's quite a few advantages, the main one being that it's just got a really big screen, so it's easier to engage a group of people behind the camera. They can all easily watch at the same time. Also, the software that we use called Filmic Pro, it's really easy to use. People like that they can just touch directly. There's no small buttons, and so it's just an easy to use piece of equipment. And in terms of, or things to watch out for, is that it has limited storage capacity. So you also really have to train your trainees in how to manage the storage on the iPad, how to take the footage off, and yeah, some other like technical parts of the iPad process. I think it's a really good tool to use, and you could use other Android tablets as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Marlene. So I'd like to bring Solly in as well. And one of the questions which we discussed a little bit prior to the call was one that came in through the registration. There were actually two questions which I think might merit sort of discussing at the same time. One of which was making the case to donors about using PV, the time needed, the technical capacity needed, etc., and how this might be done. And the other one was, of course, around funding. And the question itself was, funding is always key, not just where the basic funding comes from, but also the myriad of issues related to the everyday decisions about allocating funds, decision making, and so on. And then the final comment was, when we have used technology, a concern is it can go missing. So, Solly, we talked about this a little bit in advance of the webinar. I mean, do you have any thoughts you could share about making the case for PV to donors and where the funding piece fits in?
Yeah, I think in terms of making the case for donors, let's start with that. I would say in the last 10 years, the last 6 to 7, I've been particularly looking at the use of participatory video monitoring and evaluation. And I've seen the growth in understanding of the major donors and definitely their acceptance of it. We have worked with partners that had funding from USAID, partners with funding from DFID, partners with funding directly from different European governments, private foundations, and I think it was more of a case of being really clear on your aims. That's been my sense on all the different projects I oversee and the ones I delivered. When they understand why you're doing this, for what purpose, how this fit into your bigger M&E strategy, and your learning strategy in a way, then definitely I haven't seen any resistance. It's grown more, the acceptance, through the years when there was more examples. I think in terms of funding, what I always advise our partners and the different people I encounter from the industry in different forums is when you design your aims of why you're going to do this, for what purpose in your program, to be really strategic around the timing and what are the things you are doing, because many times this doesn't necessarily have to come only from an M&E budget. It can come from intervention lines, because this is a process of creating dialogue, amplifying the effects of the program, particularly when it's around communication or behavioral change. Also, many times it can create a forum for advocacy. So you can be quite strategic at looking at your aims and then seeing, based on what you're going to achieve, the different budget lines you can use to cover different costs. The preparation and the training that Marlene described could be, could be seen as an outsider, as intense and quite, intense resource in terms of human resources, not just money. But I would say that process, where she went twice because it was strategic and better for that context to do it in 2 sections rather than in 1 long training, then allow them to repeat this process on their own. So it's a matter of how you do it in a way that you also build capacity at national level or local level, and you can replicate this process. So yeah, if you are strategic, I don't think it's costly. I think it's quite cost effective, but it's a matter of understanding why you're going to do it, what purpose, and then designing backwards from there.
Great, Solly, thank you. I'm conscious of time and that we will need to wrap this up shortly. So I think maybe if we put out 2 final questions. We have one from Andy from Tag Team Productions in the chat. Andy says, we run a PV project with farmers in Zimbabwe. We supply them with mobile phones to document their activities in the project. Have you considered this approach or heard of it being used anywhere else? It's a DEPP project. I think I'll put that one back to Sole, actually. Question.
I would say we haven't used mobile phones just because we feel our 1-person screen is a quite small screen, and we like to do group dynamics for all the reasons we said before during this hour. So iPads have been a much better solution in our view in terms of the size of the screen and how it allows for people to come together to take the decisions of filmmaking as much as to reflect. Definitely, I think it's a good model as well, but it depends a lot on, again, on your aims. What are you tracking? Are you providing the mobile phones individually to different farmers to track their progress, and for what purpose? So of course, we know with mobile phones these days you can do so many things. So with video in particular, I would say the mobile phone restricts you more for kind of a 1-person video, which is, there are lots of great projects out there on citizen journalism and other ways of involving people in that way. But for us, the participatory approaches behind the methodology are quite crucial for creating all the space for people to come together and create that dialogue. So that's quite heavy in our way of designing programs, I would say.
Great, thank you. I mean, it's definitely those practical considerations. And I suppose for the final question, my sense is a lot of people will probably be wondering how we actually go ahead and implement this. How could we deliver a PV approach in our own program? So, Marlene, I'll put the final question to you if that's okay. And that is if InsightShare have any sort of practical suggestions for steps that agencies can take to incorporate a PV process or something similar to a PV process in their own M&E work, and if you would have any particular recommendations.
Yes, I think that's definitely possible, and particularly if you have people in your team that are already very confident with facilitating participatory processes. And then if you have someone who's also comfortable with the technical aspects, I think then if they look at the toolkit, and probably this presentation would already make a lot of sense to them, and they could just go ahead and try it out and see how it goes. It's really not a very, very complex process. It just takes the support and the encouragement of the trainees. And if you don't really have that expertise within your team, then I've actually been thinking about how could we make this kind of training available in other countries and do it in an even more cost-effective way. So what I imagine could happen is that maybe 2 staff members of several organizations come together for the training, or a combination of staff members and community trainees, and that we train those all together. So basically NGOs all working on this, or that all worked on the same disaster, for example, so that through a training program they would get the experience of doing it once with our guidance, and they could then, after the basic training, all go off and facilitate their first process themselves. So the trained staff members and community representatives doing it in communities where they worked, and then actually bring together all the data from these different communities and basically the data from different NGOs together to a collective data analysis. And that could potentially be really rich to have, to look at, the difference in the approaches from the NGOs, or the difference between communities in different parts of the country. So this is a model that we would really love to pilot with the evaluation of a specific disaster, and then bringing together staff members from various organizations, so that basically the costs of the training can really be shared, and you really bring together the experiences from various organizations. And one other thing that I would say is that I personally thought that it's not necessarily needed to have a really slick edited video. So if you're screening to audiences that are truly interested in hearing directly from the community members, the kind of basic editing that you can quite quickly train your trainees to do themselves, that those kind of rough videos can already be screened back to stakeholders. So that way you can also save a lot of time and money. I think you should only produce slick kind of post-produced videos if you also have the budget and time that is needed to properly disseminate those videos. Because just as with evaluation reports, if they don't get disseminated widely, then a lot of the value is lost. So I really would recommend any organization that would like to try this approach to really budget enough time for disseminating the videos, but also any design solutions that might come out of the project, because that's really what can improve future programs. And sadly, too often, because of the funding, this doesn't happen, and that's really such a waste. That's why we're doing all of this is for the insights to actually make a difference in future.
Brilliant, Marlene. Thank you. Most definitely, I think some really helpful tips there. And I suppose the other point to highlight is, we do have these tools and resources available. So I would encourage people to please have a look on the CDAC Network website. And also please explore the InsightShare website as well. And I think Sole has just put a link in the chat box for how you can access and sign up to the next course that InsightShare are running on the 6th to the 8th of June. So we are sort of 15 minutes over now, so I think we probably do need to get back to the rest of our days. But I think that really just leaves me to say a sincere thank you, both to Sole and Marlene for their presentations today, and also to Angela for her support. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and also for bearing with us through some of the technical challenges. But of course, if you would like to follow up on any of today's discussion, or learn more about CDAC, InsightShare or participatory video, please do get in touch with us either through InsightShare or through CDAC. Please also do check out the CDAC website for further information, events to join, and of course our newsletter. And yeah, please do get in touch. I'm sure there are lots of other questions, so we would be happy to follow up individually on them. So a big thank you to everybody for joining us, and please look out for more from the CDAC network and InsightShare in the future. Thank you very much.